Okay, good deal.
Okay, good.
Well,
all right, so it is time to get started. I know we have a few people still kind of getting logged in, so hopefully we can not get too far ahead before they get logged in, but I wanted to welcome everybody to our Ask the Auditor PCI Readiness series. Today we're going to talk about the importance of scoping and hopefully give you some good information to help you understand why that's important and how you can effectively scope your environment for PCI. So we can go ahead and get started with the next slide. So to introduce you to Kirkpatrick Price, if this is your first time attending one of our webinars, I want to let you know that Kirkpatrick Price is a PCI QSA firm as well as a licensed CPA firm. We've been providing insurance services to clients worldwide. We have about 10 years, actually more than that now, I think it's over 11 years of experience in information security assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests to strengthen information security and compliance controls. We can move on to the next. There are several ways that you can connect with us. We have a very popular blog series right now focusing on regular industry updates and best practices. Just yesterday, Sarah Morris, our managing editor, released a fantastic article, blog post about HIPAA compliance. This week, the OCR announced phase 2 audits are beginning. So if HIPAA is on your radar as well, I definitely recommend checking that out because we do have regular blog posting and information on our website about that. Also, our library of recorded webinars are all on the link provided. We have done several of the requirements for PCI so far. So we've been kind of working our way through the requirements. So if you missed any of those, please feel free to check out the link there for our recorded webinars. And also you can connect with us through LinkedIn. So me, introducing myself here, my name is Scaby. I have over 15 years of experience in information security. I'm currently serving as Vice President of Strategic Development and Chief Compliance Officer for Kirkpatrick Price. And I am focusing on assisting clients in meeting regulatory compliance as well as information security objectives. One of the things important to know about me is not all the letters for the certifications I have, but that prior to joining Kirkpatrick Price, I was an information security officer and dealt with elements such as PCI for about 15 years in my career. So I think this is a great topic for people to learn about, and I'm excited to be on this side of the audit table now and helping clients get through these sometimes complex audit processes. So we can go on to the next slide. So a little bit more about the services that Kirkpatrick Price offers, and just to give you a really high-level overview, on the regulatory compliance side, we do a lot of CFPB mock audits, as well as a lot of the policy and procedure that go along with getting ready for something like that, risk assessment, vendor compliance, management, auditing. On the information security side of our business, we also provide guidance as what you're hearing today with PCI DSS 3.1. We also perform SSA 16 audits, SOC 2, FSMA, ISO 27001, 27002. And what makes us a little bit unique is that we have our online audit manager portal that I'm not going to talk a ton about, but for those of you out there that are meeting multiple audit objectives, it definitely makes the process more streamlined as you're working your way through that. So we can go to the next slide here. So we're talking about PCI today, so if you're new to this and this is your first, kind of exposure to PCI, which may be rare, but I'm going to go ahead and explain to you what it is anyway. The Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard was jointly developed by the payment card brands to encourage and enhance cardholder data security and facilitate the broad adoption of consistent data security measures globally. So that's kind of a background of what it is. Full compliance with the 3.0 revised standard became effective January 1st. So I'm not going to read the next bullet point, but basically that's just an overview of what PCI is for those of you that may be a little bit new to it. We can go to the next slide. So who does PCI apply to? Any merchant who stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data, as well as any service provider who stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data on behalf of a merchant, as well as any sub-service provider of a merchant or service provider who has active access to their card-hold data environment. So if you're here and you're listening to this webinar, I'm sure you understand why and how, PCI applies to you. So let's go to the next slide here. So again, an overview for you. There's approximately 212 controls, 6 control objectives, and 12 subject areas. So those 12 subject areas that we were talking about with the requirements, if you're new to this and you're really trying to get familiar with what those are, I think we have a demonstration on the next slide of an overview of this. But I do want to remind everybody that we've kind of gone through step by step in this Ask the Auditor series, where we've gone through requirements 1 and 2, we've gone through 3 and 4. We're working our way down to be able to provide guidance to those that are new to the process. And also, I think it's helpful to have the auditor's perspective, because you're working on this, you're preparing your own compliance. How is the assessor going to evaluate that? And hearing kind of from our side adds a different perspective sometimes. So definitely recommend checking out those pre-recorded webinars and continuing to follow us on this series as we now have Jeff Wilder, who's joined us and is taking us through it from his perspective. So go ahead and go to the next slide here, which is where I think I introduced Jeff Wilder. So to introduce him to the webinar, he has over 15 years of experience in information security as well. Prior to joining Kirkpatrick Price, Jeff was a trainer for PCI Security Standards Council, where he was responsible for educating individuals working towards becoming QSAs. In his role now of Director of PCI Services for Kirkpatrick Price, Jeff is responsible for all aspects of PCI services. And you can see Jeff is also maintains multiple certifications. And we are very happy to have Jeff here today and to talk us through scoping. So Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So before we get into that, a couple of things that I just want to kind of prime for some future webinars that we're going to be putting forth. Our next webinar that we're going to be talking about is requirement 8, right? And then we're going to be talking about some of the requirements around penetration testing. There's some new requirements that came into play. And so our next webinar is going to be focused on requirement 8, excuse me, and then we're going to be having another webinar to talk about penetration testing. So thank you for that great introduction, Jesse. I've been in the industry for a long time. I absolutely love what I do. I love helping clients. That's one of the reasons why I worked for the council, and that's one of the reasons why I came here to KP. This is my second webinar that I've done with KP. The last one we did was on requirement 7, and today we're going to be talking about scoping. If I can go ahead and get you to move forward for us, the next slide. So one of the most important things that that an assessor can do, or that you can do as an organization, is to really identify and maintain the scope of PCI within your environment. Now, while we're specifically talking about PCI, the kind of rules that we're talking about here, if your organization is subject to HIPAA or, GLBA for financial controls, really the same philosophy is going to hold true no matter which framework that you're really being assessed against, or that you're assessing yourself against. But one of the first things that I want to talk about is that while the PCI DSS is very, very technology-centric, it's not just about technology, right? It covers the people, the process, and the technology, and it's really about anything that has the ability to impact the security of that information. So we're going to walk through, we're going to probably spend about the next half hour in talking about how PCI applies the scoping exercises, and what are those things that you need to have ready for your assessor, and to talk about what are those things that you need to have ready for them, or expect for them to be asking for you, okay? So PCI DSS specifically covers, the systems that have the ability to impact account data and sensitive authentication information, and we'll talk about exactly what that is here shortly. So if I can go ahead and get you to move forward. All right, so the first thing that an assessor is going to be doing is to be validating that you as an organization have correctly scoped the environment, right? We've got a couple of slides that we'll be talking about the importance, and there's specifically a call out within the PCI DSS. where you as the organization are specifically required to define the scope of your environment. And it's one of the most important things that the assessor should be doing is working with you to ensure that you've defined all of those things that are considered to be in scope of your environment. You know, from your perspective, if you don't know that you have an asset that's subject to PCI, right, how can you effectively expect to manage that from a security perspective? So we're going to kind of talk about some of the nuances about scoping. And you know, what I find interesting is PCI has been around now for about 10 years. And in all of my years in working with the council and working as an assessor and working here at KP, this is one of those areas, right? Scoping has been one of those areas that are just organizations really, really struggle with. And so what I'm hoping to give you from this particular webinar is to provide you with some basic tools that you can take to bear or take to your organization and to identify this is what scoping is in our environment. Now, there's always going to be those, you know, those onesie-twosie type things that are just really take a really deep dive analysis about how they impact your environment. We don't have the time to necessarily go into that, but KP is absolutely here to help you to go through that process if you need to, okay? So the first thing that your assessor is going to be doing is to working with you to define the scope of, helping you define the scope of your environment. While it's your responsibility, they're obligated as part of the assessment to making sure that you've done those things, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. So it's your responsibility within the assessment and within the processes for managing your environment. It's your obligation to maintain and to identify the scope of the environment, right? The assessor, it's the assessor's responsibility, or sorry, it's your responsibility to define the scope of the environment, right? And then once that the assessor has worked with you to define, you know, the boundaries around where PCI is stored, processed, and transmitted, then it's going to be the assessor's responsibility to define that scope of the assessment, right? So what are the systems that they're going to be looking at? Who are the people they're going to be talking to? What are the processes they're going to be examining? What facilities are we going to be looking at, right? And it's really the important that the assessor does this correctly. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. So this, the text that we see here, I'm not going to read it to you, but this is in the preamble to the PCI DSS. And what this text effectively says is that at least annually and prior to the assessment, that you, the organization, need to go through a process where you define the boundaries by which is considered PCI. Now, you're going to need to retain some evidence that you've done that activity and how you've gone about defining what is in scope, right, for your environment, because your assessor is going to be, they are required to ask you for that data and validate that you did those things correctly in order to define the scope of your environment. So it's the responsibility for establishing the scope of your environment, right, is wholly incumbent upon you, and then the assessor is just going to be validating that you've done those things. Okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. So we've kind of already talked about, right, that the scope of the PCI DSS just is not technology, right? It's just not your servers and, you know, your applications. It also covers, you know, the people and the processes. And effectively what the assessor is going to be doing is that if you have processes that, or people or technologies that are considered out of scope, right, it's really the assessor's obligation to validate your assumption that when you've said these things are out of scope, that they truly are out of scope. Now, sometimes there's a bit of finagling, right? And understand that for an assessor, when they get into your environment, in many cases, it's like drinking from a, you know, fire hose for a lot of these people. There's just so much information coming at them quickly, right? And so they need to be able to make some decisions pretty quick about what's in scope and what's not. So expect there to be some conversation around this, right, where they think that something is in scope. And you need to kind of explain to them why it's not in scope. And we're going to be talking here very shortly about the criteria that makes something in scope or what determines it for being out of scope, okay? So really they're going to be validating your assumptions of the things that are not out of, validating your assumptions of the things that would be considered out of scope, okay? So if I can get you to move forward. All right. So in order for something to be considered out of scope, there's several things that need to that need to be addressed as part of this, right? In order for something to be considered out of scope, it means that it's segmented, right? In order for it to be segmented, that literally means that exact term, that there's no connectivity, right? There's no ability for this asset to impact the security of the cardholder data. So as an assessor, what we have to do as part of this process is we have to look at it's not just your data flow diagrams, it's not just your firewall configs, your router configs, it's really everything that goes into determining how the data flows through your environment. So I'm not an advocate of standing here and reading off the slides. The slides will be made available to you after this, but for the sake of the importance of this particular slide, it's really important that you understand that having VLAN 1 and VLAN 2 and a firewall sitting between the two of them, if that firewall is allowing traffic to flow between those two VLANs, they're in scope of each other, right? In order to consider something as segmented, the firewall has to terminate the traffic and not allow the traffic to flow between VLAN 1 and VLAN 2, okay? So moving forward, right, so segmentation means exactly that. There's absolutely no connectivity. If you're allowing traffic in any way, if I can, ping, if there's, a DNS, DHCP, if those things are flowing through those environments, those systems would be considered in scope, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. Okay. So one of the things that there's a paradigm that we all need to understand, and I don't think that within the industry that it's clearly understood, the difference between what CDE means, the cardholder data environment, what that is, and what in scope means, okay? So there's a specific difference between that. Now, all systems, right, are going to be considered now after we've defined the boundary around what is considered, in scope. Understand that there's going to be systems that are considered to be in scope but are not considered the CDE, right? The CDE is not necessarily a boundary by which your cardholder data exists. The CDE is specifically defined as those systems, those processes, those people that store, process, and transmit cardholder data, right? So we have this three-legged stool. If it stores, processes, and transmits, it's the CDE. Now the CDE systems are also in scope, but then we also have the other systems that are in scope as well, and those are the systems that provide security services, right? So we have a firewall, a router, a VPN server, perhaps your authentication server, right? That would be in scope as well. We have, your log server, your NTP services, right? Those are the things that provide security services. Those are considered in scope. We have the systems that are connected to, right? So just simply having network proximity, right, where the two systems can communicate, right, between those particular subnets will bring that other set of systems into scope. Right, so to consider them out of scope, we would look to actually segment them, right, to sever the connections. So the in-scope is the systems that provide security services that are connected to, or any other system that really has the ability to impact the security of. Right, and that's kind of a gray area that's really based around, we have to look at the processes, and if there's some type of process that would impact the security of your cardholder data environment, we really need to look at that as being in scope as well, right? All right, so there's a specific difference between being in scope and the CDE. So not all systems are CDE, but all systems would be in scope. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so as we just talked about, understanding the considerations in the scope, the CDE, the systems, this is a summary of that, are the systems that store, process, and transmit. And then the systems that interact with the CDE that connected to or can impact the security of or providing those security systems, those are your in-scope devices, right? So collectively, all of those things are in scope, but the CDE is specifically store, process, and transmit, and then the rest of them are in scope as well, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so this is just a quick introduction to, what makes a system, in scope, right? What would it need to interact with in order for it to be considered in scope? And by definition of the PCI DSS, we have really two different terms that we need to account for, right? We have the cardholder data. The cardholder data is inclusive of the account data and the sensitive authentication data, right? So if we can go to the next slide. So the account data is comprised of the primary account number, right, the cardholder name in conjunction with the PAN. So if I have a cardholder name, but there's not the PAN associated with it, it is not considered account data. But where we have the cardholder name and the primary account number together, those would be considered your account data, along with the expiration date and the associated service code, okay? So let's go to the next slide.
Hey, Jeff, this is Jesse. I wanted to just remind everybody to use the Q&A feature. We are going to have some time, hopefully, at the end of the presentation to answer the questions. So I would just ask anybody to, go up to the toolbar, and under Options is where they can access that Q&A feature. And if it's fitting, based on the topic, I'll interrupt Jeff if I can find a break and ask the question. If not, we'll hold those to the end. So if Jeff is talking about something and you're still not clear, or you just have a question, I really highly recommend we'll ask those anonymous questions at the end of the presentation. So.
Okay. So Mark, I see that there's a gentleman that just asked a question about a point-to-point encryption solution. I'll be more than happy to answer that question at the end of the presentation and how scope affects that, okay? So sensitive authentication data. So we have this sensitive authentication data that is used to validate the card-present transaction, right? And that would include the data that's the full track data, or the chip, the data that's now on the chip, as we're starting to see in the United States here now. We have it's the full track data or the chip data, the CVV, CVV2, the 3 or 4 digit number that your customers would use, or the PIN or PIN block. Now, just as anytime I ever talk about SAD, just as a disclaimer, you cannot store sensitive authentication data after authorization. You do not need SAD for recurring transactions. If you need that data or some similar to that data, get a hold of your acquiring bank, and they'll help you work through that process. Okay, so the scoping of the assessment, when we talk about sensitive authentication data, we're talking about the track data, chip equivalent, the CVV, CVV2, CID, and or the PIN block data. So if you have a system that interacts with the PAN, the expiration date, the name, the service code, or the sensitive authentication data here, or has access to those systems, those are then considered in scope, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. All right. So in order for your assessor to work with you to making sure that you've done the things that you need to do in order to determine something is out of scope, there's a very specific set of things that they're going to be asking for. Now, what I would ask of you, right, is as part of your exercise to making things that are in scope, you need to have these, and part of your analysis is to making sure that you've looked at all these things and considered all of these things over the next couple of slides in order to determine what's considered in scope or out of scope, okay? So the first thing that they're going to need is a network diagram and the data flow diagram, and that's going to give the assessor a basic understanding of the outlay of your environment, or where cardholder data comes in. Now, when we look at the data flow diagram, we're trying to understand how cardholder data comes in, how it's stored, how it's processed, how it's terminated. We'll need copies of the firewall and router configs, right? And that's really because they're going to be looking at the subnets within your environment and looking at what is truly allowed to flow in and out of your environment. You're going to need a list of your applications that you're using, and if those applications are PADSS. They're going to need a list of all of those physical and logical assets that you have in your environment to understand how do these, what these assets are, if it's a database server, if it's a web server, right, if it's an application server, whatever it does. Be prepared to provide a comprehensive analysis of all of the methods and means by which your organization collects cardholder data, whether it's by a pen pad, a card swipe, whether it's by you get a file from your clients, right, that they might provide you an SFTP file, that's encrypted, right? So there's multiple things that they need to understand about how cardholder data is collected, how it's processed, right, the storage of the data. What are you doing to protect it, right? At the end of the day, what do you do to delete it? Because these are all these things that look to impact who has access to your data and what has access to your data, so scope can truly be determined. Now, the thing that I want to note here is that when you look at how data is stored, processed, and transmitted, please do not just account for how things work when everything is fine and dandy and perfect. Please also ask the question, right, what do I do with chargebacks, right? What if my process fails? What happens? How do I still continue to make money? How do I collect credit cards? How do I still service my clients if this application goes down? Because you're often going to find these out-of-band processes that management typically is not aware of. Okay, so doing an exhaustive review of these data points that we have here, these 5 data points, and understanding what you're not only doing when the processes work as they're architected, but also spend some time in asking, your organization, if this process is broke, what happens then? Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. Right, we're going to need a list of all of the people and the roles within the organization, right? Whether, everything from the call center agents, to the technology people, to the people on the front lines that are actually swiping the cards. We're going to need a list of all the physical locations, right? A list of the service providers that you have, right? If you have somebody that interacts with cardholder data on your behalf, you need to be able to talk about that and the capacity by which these individuals or these organizations, these third parties, have access into your environment. Your organization will also need to do an analysis around, are you a merchant as well as a service provider? Many of the service providers don't realize or don't, really think about the fact that how do we get paid, right? So while we might have a database file where we're processing, data for numerous clients for whatever reason, if we take credit cards for payment, you're a merchant as well, right? Or vice versa. If you're specifically a merchant, you have to ask your organization, can we impact anybody else's cardholder data? Do we have access to anybody else's cardholder data? Whether it be from a logical or physical perspective, that might make you a service provider as well, right? We'll have to get an understanding. Do you develop software, right? And what that looks like, because then that brings in a whole other set of controls and requirements that we have to look for, okay? Let's go ahead and move forward. Okay. So I would ask the question, right? A lot of the times, I would come into an environment and I'd say, I need a list of your applications, and they would say, okay, Jeff, we have this point of sale system over here, but don't worry about it. It's PADSS validated. We just upgraded to it. We just spent $1 million and, put it in our 40 stores, and it's great. It does everything, and it makes you a grilled cheese sandwich in the morning. It's perfect. So I would ask, right, if you have a payment application, and it is PADSS validated, is it in scope? Well, of course it is, right, because the PADSS validation only means that the application can be configured in a PCI DSS compliant way. It does not mean that the application has been configured and that it has been maintained in a compliant way. And as part of that, when you look at the payment implementation guide that's associated with these PADSS applications, it only covers the application. It doesn't cover the underlying systems, right? So we still have antivirus we have to be considerate of. We still have the NTP. We still have logging and, fill in the blank. So there's a lot of things that aren't covered as part of the PADSS that still need to be assessed. And the assessor should be asking what version of applications you're using, because they're going to need to go out and get a copy of the implementation guide to make sure that you've implemented that application according to what the implementation guide tells us to do. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so what about wireless, right? Is wireless in scope? And generally the question is that if an assessor walks into your environment and they open up a laptop, they bring open their little wireless thing and they look at what's going on in your environment, wireless is going to be, when you have wireless there, even if it's not storing, processing, or transmitting cardholder data, it's likely going to always be in scope, right? Even if you have wire, and let me explain that before you blow, most people blow a gasket when I say that, but there's some I need to qualify that statement a little bit, okay? So even if the cardholder data or the wireless has been absolutely segmented from your cardholder data environment, that's perfect, right? They're not going to be assessing your wireless, but what they would be doing is they would be looking at your network diagram, because one of the requirements in requirement 1 is said, look at the network diagram and making sure that all wireless has been identified. So even if wireless it has been segmented from your cardholder data environment, just, I would ask you to go look at your network diagram, and if there's any wireless in your environment at all, just please be prepared that your assessor is likely to push back and ask you to, denote that you have wireless, but show that it's absolutely segmented from your environment, okay? So if you're not using store, process, and transmit cardholder data, but if I come into an environment and I'm going to assess, your systems, and I sit down with your network administrators and I look and see that they have a wireless, right? The fact that they're using the wireless for connectivity to manage your environment generally means your wireless is going to be in scope, okay? So, so just be considerate of if wireless is in your environment, it's generally always going to be in scope for some capacity, at least at a minimum, to be shown on your network diagram. But even if it's not used for store, process, and transmit, but it's being used, or you can use wireless to connect into the cardholder data environment, that kind of brings that into scope as well, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward here. All right, so how does sampling impact the scope of the assessment, right? So the PCI DSS does not specifically define for the assessor whether they're taking 5 systems, looking at all of them, or looking at 2, or looking at 3. So once you've gone through the entire exercise of defining what is in scope, I would recommend that you ensure that all of those systems, right, that you do that scoping exercise very frequently, right, making sure that nothing's changed in your environment. Typically what I would recommend is that you have some type of hook into your change control program, so that if there is some type of change to a new system, there's a change to your network, there's a change to an application, whether it be a move add change, doesn't matter, but if there's some type of change that you ask the question, does this impact the cardholder data, any of the systems that store, process, transmit, provide security services, or connected to in any way? And if the answer is yes, then you need to go through your scoping exercise with that asset, right, making sure that it's covered with all of the necessary security controls are in place, okay? But the PCI DSS does not define what sampling looks like. It says that if you are going to be sampling, the assessor just needs to justify what that sampling looks like. But I'm going to take you through the next couple of slides and talk to you a little bit about what sampling looks like from the scoping perspective, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. All right. So sampling is just not about the number of servers, okay? So if I come into an environment and they have, let's say I just have a general policy that I'm going to take 25% for my sample. And if I come into your environment and you say, well, Jeff, I have 100 servers, in the assumption is I'm going to look at 25, that may not be necessarily true. Because really what we're looking for is when we look to sample, we need to make sure that the systems that we sampled or that are part of what I call a sample pool, that all of those systems are identical in nature. They're used for the same purpose, managed by the same people, at the same facility, right, managed by the same processes and procedures, that everything is identical. Then I can look to create a sample pool from that, and then that's where I take my 25%. So you might have different business processes on 30 different servers. Well, I have 30 different sample sets now that I need to take 25% from. So when a lot of times when assessor says, you know, we have a 25% assessing methodology, you know, a sample methodology, you need to really kind of understand what that means and how that equates to the sample pool. If they are just simply taking 25% of your systems because that's the number that they use, I would take an opportunity to push back a little bit, because you want somebody that's going to make sure that all of the systems that they're looking at are being used for the same purpose. And effectively, that provides some assurance that there's little or no deviation in your organization. Okay? Sorry, my screen just went black on me. Give me just 30 seconds. I apologize.
Well, the good news, Jeff, is we have a lot of questions for the end. It looks like we're very close to the end of your slides.
Okay.
So
what are we, while I'm getting, okay, so I'm back up. So let's go ahead and move forward to the next slide. I apologize. So once this pool is, there needs to be an assessment. So as part of understanding the scope, right, be prepared to say that, you know, where I have one authentication server, right, one Active Directory, one LDAP server, whatever it is, that might be, you know, fine. We're going to look at one. But if I have 100 different servers that are application servers, and we're processing data differently for different clients or doing different things with them, please be prepared to identify what these actual servers are going to be used for, who's managing them, where they're physically at, you know, all of these things that might be or might cause a variance in the way that the security controls are being managed, okay? And remember that having different people, different processes, and different technology are going to impact, you know, your scope, right? And because of that, then we need to then look at the sample set that's going to be used as part of the assessment. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so we're coming to the end of the assessment, right, as part of this. Just understand that that in order for the assessor to do a comprehensive scoping exercise, they're going to need to look at a lot of documentation. They're going to need to configure or look at a lot of the configurations on your systems. They're going to need to spend a lot of time interviewing your staff. In most cases, my first half of the day, the first usually 4 to 6 hours of the very first thing that I did, right, when I'm engaged with your organization, is just spent in understanding what it is that you're doing and how it is that you're going about doing that. You know, so please understand that each assessor might have different methods or means by which they validate that you as an organization are appropriately and effectively establishing scope. But ultimately, getting to the point, they're going to need all this information. Having you have already processed this and your understanding of what your environment is, and then looking to work with your assessor to explain why this particular asset is out of scope. Your assessor should walk into your environment kind of with the mindset that everything is in scope until, you know, there's enough evidence to suggest that it's not. Okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. I think
Jeff, I have a related question that kind of just keys on what you just said. So what if it says, what if I don't agree with my QSA's assessment of what is in or out of scope? Who has the final say? Interesting question.
Right. So that is a really good question, and whoever submitted that, thank you, right? Because I'm sure that I know that I've had that issue many a times where I'm working with a client and they don't agree with me in terms of scope. Remember that your QSA is not an adversarial relationship. This is not an audit. This is an assessment. They're there to opine on your organization on behalf of those individuals that own the credit card data. If you're a merchant, that's your acquiring bank. If it's a service provider, it's your clients. Right. So ultimately, if there cannot be a general agreement as to what is considered in scope and out of scope, the first thing that I do is the rules are, right, and I have my hand up here. You can see my little five fingers wiggling. Ask these 5 questions, and if the answer to any of these questions is yes at any point in time, it is in scope, end of discussion. Okay, so the first question is does it store? Does it process? Does it transmit? If any of those answers are yes to any one of those 3, it's in scope. Okay. The next one, does it provide security services, right? So is it an authentication server? Is any one of this particular asset providing services that are then called out in the DSS, the file integrity monitoring, the logging, the NPP, you know, the VPN, right? Any of those types of services, if it provides a security service, it's in scope. Now, the next one is that where clients typically, this is where the pushback becomes, and they don't like this, but if there is connectivity, if there's any connectivity at all, it's in scope. Okay, so ask your team, ask your organization that you're working with, you know, your teammates, and part of the scoping questions that you're doing, if any one of those 5 questions happen to be true, it's considered in scope. Now, if there's still additional pushback, right, or if there's still from your assessor or from, you know, your teammates, ultimately the acquiring bank, if you're a merchant, the acquiring bank owns that liability. Get on the horn, get on the phone with your acquiring bank and say, look, we're having a hard time understanding this. You know, we need you to work with me to understand what the scope really is. Is this in scope or not, right? So the final arbiter of whether something is in scope or not is your clients that you're hosting their cardholder data in your environment or have the ability to impact it, or it's your acquiring bank if you're a merchant. So that's the way that we go about that, Jesse. Okay?
So Jeff, I have another related question based on what you just said. I love that visual of your 5-finger approach there. That's pretty cool. But somebody asked, and I think other people are out there kind of thinking about this, when you said connectivity, what does connected to really mean?
Right.
It seems like connected to makes it impossible to contain scope. What do you have to say about that?
So the connected to yeah, you're right, Jesse, and to whoever asked that question, right? The connected to is kind of a nebulous thing. And from the assessor perspective, when we look at connectivity at layer 3, right, if we have IP connectivity, it's in scope, right, end of discussion. But we really need to start looking at connectivity from the layer 2 perspective. As a given example, if I have cardholder data flowing through a switch on VLAN 1, but on that switch I'm also trunking for VLAN 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, because the switch itself is transmitting cardholder data, it's in scope, right? But does that then necessarily mean that my VLAN 2 and 3 and 4 are in scope? Well, that's where the processes come in, is we have to look at what controls do you have to prevent somebody from compromising your switch, you know, flooding the MAC tables and turning it into a hub, right? That's a process where we could impact the security of it, potentially bringing those other devices, other VLANs into scope. So really, we start to look at it from a layer 3 perspective. We are considerate of layer 2. Your switches are always going to be in scope. Your assessor should be looking at the security controls that you have there. But if it's just purely at the layer 1, at the physical connection into the device itself, does not necessarily bring that in scope unless somehow that physical connection then can cause the compromise of cardholder data, and then at that point, then we have to consider that in scope. Remember, if you can impact the security of cardholder data, it's in scope. And that's really what this boils down to, Jesse. Okay?
All right. So we do have several other questions, but we can go ahead and wait till you're done with
Okay.
the slides.
Sure. So I think we have just maybe a couple more slides here. So in conclusion, right, scoping, as I've talked about, everything is really just, what I've provided you is really just black and white, right? And what's not covered here, and we really don't have the time for in this presentation, is to talk about those shades of gray, right? Understand that KP can work with you and is more than happy to, if you want to send us an email, if you want to get us on the call, I really don't mind spending, whatever necessary time that you need in order to make your organization successful, right? That's what I love doing. I love helping organizations, understand these nebulous concepts. We are really here to help. These presentations that we're providing, we do this just simply because we want to add value to you and your organization, whether you're our client or not. We would love for you to be our client, but really we're here to help to educate the industry. So KP can help with that if there's these really, really hard things, or really, a lot of questions we get is around, well, how does a jump server impact the security of our cardholder data? Is a jump server in scope? Where does the scope stop? I saw a question here that we're probably going to pick up where somebody was asking a question about the point-to-point encryption solution, right? How does that affect scope? Those questions are going to be more prevalent, right? And we have to look at, the individual nature of each of those. But if you can just remember those 5 questions, does it store, process, or transmit? If the answer is yes, it's in scope. If it provides security services, if it impacts the security of, right, or if it's connected to, it's in scope, right? So if you can remember those 5 questions, you can probably account for 90% of the assets pretty easily in your environment. And it's only those last 10% that you need to really pull back the layers of the onion and see what's going on, okay? So we are here to help. So if you'd like, send us a question, email me. I think my contact is in the next slide there. Email me, send Jesse an email, reach out to us, give us a call. We are absolutely here to help you. All right. So thank you for attending. So Jesse, I see that we have several questions here. So if you want to go ahead and start going through them, I think that we probably have time to address them all.
Sure. Yeah, I did want to comment to people listening too. My email address is on the screen there for them to see, but if you want to contact Jeff directly, it's just j.wilder@kirkpatrickprice.com. And like I said, if you want to contact him, or if you need me to forward something, that's absolutely fine. But Jeff does love to answer questions. So if we don't get to all the questions we have today, in fact, Jeff, I was thinking we needed a webinar just for, Q&A, just kind of an Ask the Assessor type of webinar. So anyway, something to think about for future.
Sure.
But I do want to jump into, there's a couple of questions here that relate to a Tier 1 merchant. So let's go through these. The question is, for a Tier 1 merchant that has just implemented a P2PE project for the retail stores that include P2PE certified applications and components, not solution, how does the scope in the store change? What remains in scope other than the pin pad?
Absolutely. This is a really great question. So, so I can give you the generic answer to this question, and it has to be generic because there's a lot of things that change this. And this is one of those situations that might warrant a call, an individual call or an individual conversation after the webinar here. But the point-to-point encryption solution, effectively, if that solution is specifically listed on the council's website, and it has been point-to-point validated by a point-to-point encryption assessor, right? While that particular device is in scope, everything downstream, lock, stock, and barrel has been removed. That is a very generic answer, but there may be very specific things in your environment that change that. What I would recommend doing if you're a merchant, which it sounds like you are, if it is a point-to-point encryption solution, ultimately it's your acquiring bank that's going to give you any reduction of scope, okay? So I would recommend reaching out to them, and that's something that KP would be more than happy to help facilitate those conversations with your acquirer, to kind of talk through those items, or even maybe get on a call with your acquirer to help you understand what the impact of that is. If it is just merely an industry, what we call a P2P-ish solution, there's a lot of vendors that have a point-to-point encryption solution, but it's not validated against the PCI standards, the PCI Council's standards. Then ultimately, once again, the Council's perspective is there's no scope reduction. That if you want scope reduction, you need to go to your acquiring bank for that. Okay.
So Jeff, would that be?
Sorry,
go ahead. I was going to say, would that be a similar response, I guess, to the very similar question about an iframe solution for e-commerce channel, such that the web servers now only receive tokens? How does this change the scope of the e-com system? I was wondering if that was kind of a similar response.
Yeah. Well, it not really, right? So if the device that we're looking at, so in a cardholder data environment where we have tokenization, we have to assume that if your organization receives a credit card number, then provides that credit card number to a tokenization service or to your bank, and then the bank returns the token, the environment that receives that cardholder data initially would be considered in scope, okay? Typically, anything downstream from that, then we apply our five-fingered, the store process, transmit, impact, security of. Those other systems may be in scope if there's connectivity to the systems that do the capture the credit card and send it off to your tokenization. If your environment is just interacting with the token and you never, ever, ever see the cardholder data, right, a token that cannot be reversed into a credit card is not considered cardholder data. And that is a really good way to minimize the scope of your environment. And one of the things that I wanted to mention as part of this conversation, the easiest way to get compliant and to maintain compliance is not to have the cardholder data at all, right? If you can architect solutions where, part of your environment or part of your client's environment or whomever, where they're not actually interacting with any cardholder data, right, they're not in scope, providing those, my five-finger, questions hold true, right? So where we look at truncating the data where it's not the full 16-pan digits or where it's a token, those values are not considered to be cardholder data. And appropriately architected, you can consider everything downstream from that out of scope, okay? But once again, that's just the generic high level, without actually doing a full architecture review and all those other things, it is capable and possible to architect solutions like that, but the generic answer is anything that's downstream from that can be considered out of scope. Okay.
So Jeff, I have another question.
Yep.
Yeah, I have another question, and I feel like it's related, and we get this question a lot from clients. The question is, if you have a call center environment that records the calls for quality assurance purposes, where customers could be saying their PAN and related information, would the phone system be considered in scope?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. So when we have to look at the call recording system, and this is really, Jesse, the same conversation around the email, right? And the way that the council has kind of defined this is that if you're running a call center and you have a business process where you're collecting account data over the phone or through email, right, if you have a business process that supports those activities, then you need to consider them in scope, and they need to be, they need to be protected accordingly. However, if you do not have a business process by which you process cardholder data over the phone or over, the email, if somebody happens to just merely send you an email, right, or they give you the cardholder data in a voicemail, so to speak, that does not necessarily bring it in scope unless you then take that cardholder data and process it. Ideally, what you want to do is if you want to keep your voicemails out of scope, there's a couple, your voicemail system, if you want to keep your call center recording systems out of scope, there's a couple of things that you want to consider as part of your solution. There's a technology called pause on demand, where if you're going to be interacting with cardholder data, it happens at a certain point. You pause the call, the client gives you the cardholder information, and then the call recording is resumed, right? That way we're not, once again, the easiest way to keep it out of scope is not to have it. But if you are taking credit card numbers over the phone as part of your process, then you need to consider your phone system, your IP telephony, your call recording, your IVR, your VRU, right? All of those systems, remember, if it stores, processes, and transmits, it's in scope, okay? So once again, that's just the high-level generic answer. I always have to give the disclaimer. If you'd like to have some very specific questions, I'm more than happy to work with you on that, okay?
All right, great. So we have a couple more questions. I think 2 of these are related, so I'm going to go ahead and read off a very brief question and then a more detailed question that I feel like they may be related. So the first one is, what is the impact of where authentication occurs in the cardholder data environment or outside? Okay, so that's the easy question. The second one is, what types of support systems that don't process, store, or transmit cardholder data are in scope for PCI? And do all requirements apply to them, or only the requirements that are germane to the security services offered to the system, right, the store, process, transmit? Right.
Well, that was a mouthful. Let's talk about, give you a scenario. Like, that was a great question, because this is always one that is a bit confusing about defining scope, right? So let's say we have a system a database server for matters of conversation, and we have cardholder data in it. We have encrypted cardholder data in it, and that sits in a segmented environment, okay? However, we need to be able to authenticate to that server. So we have a port open between our authentication server and that database server, right? So based on our 5 questions, Jesse, is our authentication storing, processing, or transmitting cardholder data? No, okay? But is there connectivity? Yeah, there's connectivity. So the mere fact that we have connectivity, the mere fact that we're providing security services means that particular authentication server is in scope, okay? But remember, there's a difference between being in scope and being the CDE. And specifically, it's the CDE is the systems of store, process, transmit. And then the other 3 questions are as they relate to the CDE. So now we've said that our authentication server is in scope, but the receptionist, Jesse, and this is a question for you, right? So now we have a receptionist that's using the same authentication server as the database server. So because the authentication server is in scope and the receptionist connects to that authentication server, does that bring her box in scope? So I would ask you that question. What would you suspect?
I feel like I'm being tested. I would say yes.
Well, let's ask our 5, and that's why I'm asking this, right? Let's ask our 5 questions as it relates to the receptionist desktop, Jesse. So is her computer storing, processing, or transmitting cardholder data? No, right? But then we have the other 3 questions. Is her box providing security services to the cardholder data environment? No. Is her computer connected to, does it have connectivity to the cardholder data environment? Remember, cardholder data environment is store, process, and transmit. So if she's just merely connecting to the authentication server, that does not necessarily bring her box in scope, okay? So we kind of look at it as there's one layer of separation, right? So, and once again, this is where we start getting into the gray areas of PCI. The authentication server is going to be in scope, but that doesn't make it the CDE. Then we have to look at the other assets. Then can the other assets impact the security of the cardholder data through the authentication server? And if that answer is yes, then those assets are being in scope, okay? So the starting position that we need to look at from, do all of the requirements apply to all in-scope assets? And generally the starting position is yes, okay? But we have to use that yes statement a little bit sparingly. I think there's a little bit of room for wiggle, right? And from the authentication server, where we have our Active Directory server, when we look at the controls that need to apply, yeah, I would say everything needs to be applied. But then when we look at the, let's say for matters of conversation, the receptionist desktop is in scope, okay? Do we need to have a file integrity monitoring server on the receptionist desktop, right? Does that really add much value to the security posture? Is that really where we want to be spending our resources and our assets? Probably not. But you're still going to make sure that the authentication is there. We're still going to make sure the logging is there. You know, we're still going to make sure that it's, you know, that it's being patched, right? So generally speaking, the answer is yes. All the requirements would apply. But for file integrity monitoring, you know, that's one area where I'm probably, as an assessor, not necessarily turning a blind eye, but just using my auditor's discretion and saying it's fine, that you probably don't need it there. But that's just me. Okay. So I think that we're to the top of the hour.
We're out of time.
Yep. So in departing here, like I said, I really truly do mean that. If there's anybody that you didn't get the specific answer to, or you'd like to schedule some time to just kind of go through some of the items that we just didn't cover in terms of scoping, or you have some specific questions, please feel free to give me an email. My email address is j.wilder@patrickprice.com, and I'm more than happy to spend whatever time necessary to give you the tools you need to be successful. Okay. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jesse.
Today, we will send out a copy of the presentation afterwards with an email, and we look forward to the next webinar. Thank you so much, Jeff, for everything.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.